for you that we are now recording so that people can catch this. So to give folks some background, I don't, everyone's coming from a different place. This is the first of a series of political education sessions that we are putting on as the political education working group about the question of independent parties and political parties in America. And we'll go sort of get into what that means and what it's about and why I think it's important for us to talk about. But let me go into sort of what the overview is of the whole series. So this is part one. It was originally supposed to be 2 weeks ago. I got sick, so now it's happening today. So there are 4 pieces to this. And what I'm doing today is really getting into something that almost seems too simple to talk about, but for that reason, I think is important to talk about, which is what do we even mean when we talk about a party or a political party? Because it's something that gets thrown around a lot on the left, in DSA, outside of DSA, about DSA, about the Democrats, about other organizations, and I think we need to sort of set do some groundwork before we can get into some of the more detailed questions about what really politically motivated this, which is building alternative political formations, in particular to the Democrats in the United States, which is what is going to be in the subsequent session to this one that's going to get into more concretely third parties in the history of the US, particularly in the last, say, 100 years or so. The Green Party, the Working Families Party, the Communist Party, a number of other formations, the Labor Party. I'm still putting this together. And so part of, if people have sort of, feedback I get from this session will partly guide what ends up in that part. But that's going to be the second part. The third part is going to get into something that I'm going to tease a bit today, but that is going to be done in more detail in the third part, which is the electoral strategy of what I'm calling modern DSA. DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, has existed since the early 1980s. I've been a member of it since the late 1990s, but there's a break that happens after the 2016 election when we have a massive growth in membership and a massive transformation of the organization. And then there's a rethinking of what it means to engage with party politics, with electoral politics. And I'll give sort of some of the origin points of that today, and we'll get into that in more detail in the third part. And then we're going to conclude this series with an open discussion, some in a format we've done before that's really more about, doing a little bit of table setting, but really letting people have a space to do political discussion and debate in a way that we don't always have room for as we're doing our day-to-day organizing, and we're making phone calls and we're door knocking and we're going to meetings, and we don't always have the space to hash out what we believe and what we want strategically and long term as an organization. And so the hope, these pieces are separate. Hopefully people can come in and out as they please. There'll be, recordings, there'll be readings provided, but hopefully we're trying to create a baseline for people to have the kind of discussion that you need to be able to have to be the kind of organization that DSA is, which is an ideological organization, an organization with a bigger strategic vision than just the next campaign or the next election. But to start with, we just have the one session that we're doing today, which I'm just calling, what are political parties anyway? What are we talking about? Before we can talk about independent parties or alternatives to the Democrats or any of that, we need to talk about what we mean by political parties. So before we get to that, I'll just start with the community agreements that we typically do at the start of meetings. These are the first ones are just the basic ones we use in all meetings. We'll keep progressive stack, meaning that we'll prioritize people that have not been speaking as much or people that are not typically represented in meetings. We want to encourage people to step up if they're not been participating as much, step back. They haven't been, try not to dominate conversation or repeat what others have said, use I statements, don't interrupt people, try to listen to what people are saying. ask questions, assume best intentions out of people, but challenge where you disagree. And, we learn by making mistakes. And then the thing I want to emphasize for this particular session for everyone who's here, we've got a small group and I appreciate everyone who's here. And I really want, I'm going to be talking a lot here. I'm going to be throwing a lot of stuff at you, but I really encourage you, if something is not making sense to you, or you're curious about something, or you just have a question, speak up, throw it in the chat, say stack in the chat, or say something there, or stick your, hand up or something using the Zoom features. Because the premise of this session and this entire series is that there's a lot of talk about independent parties, about the Democrats, that's not very well grounded in what these terms mean. And we're trying to fix that. We're trying to get ourselves to a place where we can have intelligent discussions about things that are not in the realm of like people, yelling on Twitter or just sort of like speaking in slogans. Like we want to sort of understand what we're talking about. And, that happens best by you speaking up when you have a question. So please do that. I will greatly appreciate anyone who has the courage to do so. All right. So I'm going to just get into it now. We'll see. I'm trying to not talk for more than like half an hour here, and then we can chat for a little while. We have an hour to an hour and a half. So what I'm trying to go through today, number one, what do we mean when we talk about a political party? Meaning, what is a party and who makes it up? And we'll get into what that means. Two, what are the limits of the existing parties, particularly electoral parties, as we experience them around the world, but especially in the United States? And I'll talk a bit about the idea of party politics having been sort of hollowed out and how people are reacting to that and how we might react to it. And finally, this question that sort of motivated, one of the questions that sort of motivated this entire series is like, should we build a third party? A third party alternative in particular to the Democrats. What would it mean to do that? And what is the significance of the ballot line, that line that says Democrat next to it or says something else next to it that you vote on? That I wanted to do this series in part because this has come up. It's come up in previous political discussions we've had, particularly around, for example, the genocide in Gaza over the last year and a half and the shameful reaction of the Democrats to that. Now we see it also in their reaction to Trump. The manifest failures of the mainstream of liberalism constantly raises this question. We need something different. We need an alternative. How is that supposed to work? And we're not going to get all the way, well, we're certainly not going to answer that question. We're not really going to get all the way to even addressing it this time, but we're going to start getting it. So a question, so that's a couple of questions that sort of will get us going here, one of which is a common question that arises, in my experience, in DSA, among new members, among prospective members, among people who are just curious about the organization, which is DSA a party? And you may have asked that question. You may have answered that question. And it's not as simple a question as it seems, I think. And it's connected to another question that is perhaps less often asked, but that I think is related to it, is, are the Democrats a party? And you may or may not understand why I would ask that question or why that would be a question. But I'm going to try to get into why it is a question and why we should care about it. So I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody wants to say, either in the chat or on mic, when I talk about a party in the political sense, a political party, what do you think of? What is it? What makes something a political party? And there's no right answer to this, and there's no wrong answer to this, and there's probably no right answer to this, is the long and short of it. I'm just curious. You're all here because you're interested in this topic to one degree or another. And so I want to see if I can elicit any response from you to like, what is a political party? What is it for? What does it do? What makes something a political party? If no one wants to jump in, I'll just continue on. But okay, here we go. Grace. A group that nominates candidates with certain shared values for elections. Okay, there we go. There's one that gets right in the wheelhouse. Amy, I would guess any group of people that shares beliefs they collectively want reflected in governance. Okay, so we already have a slight divergence. One is specifically about candidates, and another talks about shared beliefs and governance, but not necessarily uh, candidates. And again, no wrong answers and probably no right answers, but these are both certainly in the universe of things that I thought I might elicit. So I'll put forward that we can say that like a political party has got something to do with organization, right? It's about us coming together, you know, as Amy says, a group of people that shares beliefs and is coming together in an organized fashion, not just to spout off about what we believe, but to organize it in some way with members, leaders maybe, and some kind of accountability between them. We have political goals of some kind that we're coming together for and a strategy to achieve them. And I would say some relationship to the state, meaning to the government, whether that means taking power directly through elections or otherwise, or trying to influence the government. I think, to me at least, people can debate this. I would say that some relationship to the state is sort of like how political party formation should be conceived. But this encompasses a lot of things. And this is where we get into these questions about like, what is a party exactly? So there we go. So there's like sort of narrow and broad ways you can talk about this, and what Grace and Amy responded with sort of get into some aspects of this. So one way you can look at it is as, pretty close to what Grace said, a political organization that contests elections and tries to win positions in government. So if you define a party that way, well, that would make DSA a party, right? Like we do that. We are a political organization. And one of the things we do, not the only thing we do, but one of the big things we do is run people for office, support our candidates for office, and try to win positions like we have with Sarah Hanna in the assembly, with people like Giselle Martinez in the Newburgh City Council, and so on. And by that standard, the Democrats would also be a party because they do that too. Although there's a lot of caveats to that. We're going to get into this, but the Democrats are a complicated case. So just bear that in mind as we go through this. Now, there's an even more narrow definition that you can use, which is often one that people have in mind in the United States in particular, which is that a party is a political organization that runs candidates on its own ballot line, meaning that it says your party next to your name on the ballot that you get on election day. By that standard, DSA is not a party. And if you've ever been told or have ever said that DSA is not a party, this might be what you mean, because when we elect people, usually it will say Democrat next to their name, or in New York State, it might also say working families next to their name, but it won't say Democratic Socialist most of the time. Whereas if you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat. It says Democrat next to your name. And so in that sense, the Democrats are a party, but again, we'll get into the complication here. So this is one of, I think, the ambiguities that particularly the American system creates, and we'll get into the details of that later on. But if we step back from this very narrow conception, political organization that is running on its own ballot line, there's a much broader conception of the party that I think we have to think about, which is much closer to what Amy was talking about, that is a group of people organized around shared beliefs that want that reflected in government action in some way, but not necessarily through a narrow electoral lens. So what I'm calling a political membership organization that pursues political change, maybe, but not necessarily through elections. DSA, certainly a party in that sense, since not only do we run candidates for elections, we do tenant organizing, we do labor organizing, we do mutual aid, we do political education like this. These are all ways in which we try to act politically in the world as an organized group of people with shared beliefs. The Democrats, well, outside of running in elections, in what way do they coherently do any of this? Well, this is where this whole question of the Democrats as a party starts to fall apart. But again, I'm just teasing something that I'm going to get to a little more later. But I also want to talk about, there's also other things that call themselves parties, things that we think about that fall within this broader definition. So the Black Panther Party, for example, outside of some very specific instances, they were not super engaged in electoral politics or running candidates directly for office, certainly not under the name of the Black Panther Party, but they were engaging in community self-defense and running things like the free breakfast program and doing political education, all these other things similar to what DSA does, and consider themselves a party and are considered by many people as a party. And I think we should consider that in the realm of party politics. Or, of course, if you think about parties engaged in illegal situations or armed struggle situations, the July 26th movement, which became the Communist Party of Cuba after the revolution, anybody in an illegal situation, which fortunately, so far in Trump's America, we are not yet in as DSA, but, the Communist Party was illegal in Hitler's Germany, but it was still a party, I would say, even though it could not run in elections. So there's this broader sense of what a party is. And what is the purpose of calling our collectivity of people a political party that I think we have to start with. Then, however, once we've sort of conceived of this collectivity, the question of what the party is, like what it does, what it stands for, is somewhat separate from who the party is. And this also bears on the questions that we face as socialists in the United States. So we can think of the party as being a membership organization. It is made up of individual members of that party. It can be the leaders of the party, which might be the ones setting the agenda and asking people to follow them. It could be the elected officials of the party, if it's an electorally focused party, who are the ones actually setting the agenda. And it can be some combination of all of these things. And so I want to now stop and sort of like give some actual concrete examples of structurally how different these different organizations we're talking about that we might call parties or we might not can be. So I'm going to put stuff up on the screen here, and these are just sort of like semi-random examples of parties. And the first one I'm taking is from the Labour Party of the United Kingdom, and I'm starting there because it is organizationally simpler than the US example that I'm going to get to. So the Labour Party, at least in principle, it's a little more complicated than this, but here's what I have on the screen is a graphic that I just took from one local branch of the Labour Party of the United Kingdom, the biggest sort of left liberal party in the United Kingdom. And this is from Barrow and Furness constituency, which is constituencies are like congressional districts, basically. They're like you elect someone to represent you from a constituency. But in the Labour Party, when you are a member of the party and the individual members are members of a constituency, they have branches, they elect delegates from their constituency who go to the Labour Party conference and elect a leadership of the party, which then is making decisions about the party platform, is making decisions about who the candidates are going to be. That is the structure that they have. Is this sort of like this is the relationship between membership and leadership and the people who run for office and are elected to office. It's not totally dissimilar to the structure of DSA, which you can see here. This is from the DSA website. This looks convoluted, but the important thing, on the diagram that I have on the screen, is it shows on the right, there's a big box that says membership. If you are a member of DSA, it means you paid dues to National DSA. You are a member, and you are then also a member of whatever local chapter is in the area you happen to live in, or if there is no chapter, you're considered an at-large member. Either way, you participate directly in the governance of the organization by voting for delegates to the every 2-year national convention, which is happening this summer. We're in the midst of people not being nominated to be delegates to the national convention. This chapter, Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, has 11 delegates this year. And those delegates who represent all of us, the membership in the chapter, will go to the national convention and elect what's on the left there, the National Political Committee, which is the leading body that hires the national director, the highest paid staff member of DSA, generally sets political priorities beyond what has already been set by the convention itself. And is that is the sort of the transmission belt between being a member and directly influencing who the leadership is, who the staff is, what the national organization is doing. Now, I put those first because at least formally, at least at a high level of abstraction, they have some similarities to them. Now let's look at another example from the Democrats. This is, again, I just took one that had a sort of easy to look at graphic. You could find things like this from all over the place. This happens to be the Michigan Democratic Party. And this is what they put up as their representation of what the structure of the Michigan Democratic Party is. And if you look at it, it has, well, there's a chair and a COO and some officers and some committees and some staff. There's a place for interns and volunteers here at the bottom to kind of come up there. Then somehow this is connected to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, which is a national body that has influence over like the national convention and the nomination process. And it all points into this like D logo here, which is, I guess, just that's what the Democrats are. Now, the thing about this that's you might notice if you've come to this after looking at the other examples we've had is there's no members here. This is not it's not clear what it would mean to be a member of this party because there's sort of no feed in from just join the party and then influence all these other structures that exist above it. And the reality is that because that doesn't exist. This is often obscured by the way leading Democrats and their fundraisers talk about this. I cannot resist putting up here one of my least favorite fundraising appeals, and I don't like any of the Democratic fundraising appeals, but this in particular, coming out in the name of House Speaker, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, talks about how, it's for fundraising, it's telling them to give money, but it says, I need you to renew your Democratic membership. My Democratic membership? Membership of what? Like if I join DSA, I know I get a say in who the leadership of DSA is and what the national direction of DSA is. If I give money to this email, what do I have influence over? And the answer is, as we will see, nothing. It's just a fancy word for fundraising. And even liberals are starting to recognize the problem with this, and we'll come to this in a moment. But I want to make a brief digression to talk about how this is just a symptom, actually, of a much bigger problem, that the party system, in particular, like electoral party system, has, not just in the US, but in many other countries, especially rich countries like North America and in Europe, which is what's called the sort of hollowing out of the party system, in which this connection between sort of elected officials and leaders and the mass base of parties has diminished over time to where other parties look more and more like what the Democrats look like. And to give sort of like, I'm just giving a quick sort of like political science digression here about the way sort of mainstream bourgeois social science thinks about political parties. And this is from E. Schatzsnyder from 1942. This is a very famous political scientist talking about political parties and the way that he says that political parties created democracy and that modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. And he goes on to say that essentially this is the difference between democracy and dictatorship. If you have parties, you have democracy, and if you don't, then you don't. The parties are not merely appendages of the modern government. They're in the center of it and play a determinative and creative role in it. However, what the hollowing out thesis, associated among others with the late political scientist Peter Mayer in his book Ruling the Void in 2013, says that essentially we've seen a decline of parties, and in particular decline of what he called mass parties, in which there is like an activated base that is sort of like that is loyal to and is connected to the leaders and the elected officials of the parties. that they're essentially the parties are just a sort of they're elected officials and associated, consultants and fundraisers and media figures, but that they're not connected to that mass base of voters anymore. He says parties are increasingly failing in their capacity to engage ordinary citizens who are voting less. They're less tied to parties. The parties can no longer adequately serve as a base for the activity and status of their own leaders, who then direct themselves toward their own sort of little clique of consultants, toward their donors, toward the media, toward NGOs, and so on. And so he goes on to say the parties are failing because the zone of engagement, the traditional world of party democracy where citizens interacted with and felt a sense of attachment to their political leaders, is being evacuated. And so in a way, the Democratic Party in the US is just an extreme example of what we see everywhere. Because even formally more member-based and mass-based parties like the Labor Party that I just showed show this phenomenon as well, that that it has become less democratic and the leaders have become more disconnected from the base. And liberals recognize that this is a problem. So after this last election, after Trump was elected again, you had a number of reactions to this, noting this problem and trying to figure out a way to fix it. So here, what I have on the screen is something from a guy named Pete Davis, who wrote in The Nation right after the November election last year, and talked about the problem of the Democrats basically being this hollowed out formation that had no connection between the sort of elite and the base. And he says this about the debate about when Joe Biden ultimately dropped out of the race, and when people were calling for him to drop out of the race after it was clear that he was mentally incompetent. And he says, when I floated to a group of party activists the possibility of every local chair hosting an emergency meeting to deliberate with their members about what the party should do, and then transmit their responses to national party leaders, which, this is what you might think a party would do. He says the most common response was, I don't think we are even capable of gathering our own party membership to participate in such a discussion, which is not surprising if you consider that it's not even clear who their membership really is, which we'll come back to. Now, he has some ideas about like how Democrats can fix this. And he says, well, okay, here's some ideas. Um, here's how we can firm up this connection between the base and the leadership of the party. He says we need membership cards that make people feel like they're members of the party. We need neighborhood captains who are like in charge of seeing where people are at a local level. We need to pay for the party should be paying for meeting halls in local communities where like events can happen and gatherings can happen. We need to be investing in mutual aid. This all sounds not terrible, uh, except that there is a bit of a problem with it, which is if we're going to do all this, we come back to this problem of what does it mean to be a member of the Democratic Party? And I keep harping on this point because I think it's important, not just because liberals need to understand it, because the left needs to understand it too. Because you often get in conversations with people on the left about the Democrats or being a member of the Democrats or being inside or outside the Democrats, which I think doesn't kind of think carefully about this question. So who are the members of the Democrats? Are the elected officials? Those are certainly the most prominent people we would call Democrats, whether it's our local elected officials or the national Democrats. It could be the party committee members. Now, I don't know what range of experience people here have had with the sort of apparatus of the Democratic Party as it exists locally, but some of us have been implored at various occasions to become members of the Democratic committees, which exist at the city level, at the town level, at the county level, at the state level. I will say that those committees, generally speaking, sometimes committee members are elected, sometimes they're appointed. They generally don't have much direct power or influence. They're meant to sort of drum up support for Democrats, maybe fundraise, maybe collect signatures, but they don't actually have a tremendous amount of power. a lot of times when people talk about being a member of the Democratic Party, what they're really talking about is being a registered Democratic voter, which is interesting because unlike, for example, being a member of DSA, registering as a Democrat is not registering actually with a party, it's registering with the government. It's telling the government, this is whose party primary I would like to vote in. So it's sort of strange to consider those as the members, even though that's how people think of it, or they maybe think of it in an even broader sense or an even vaguer sense as Democrats being like people who vote for the Democrats in general elections, and Republicans are people who vote for Republicans. Uh, and that's even less connected to any kind of sense of a party in the way we were talking about before as some kind of accountable structure that connects members and leaders. So for what the Pete Davis article I showed earlier, for that to make sense, it only makes sense, well, it can mean two things. It either requires you to have a much more formal structure of the party than what actually exists, or it's just another marketing gimmick, membership cards and all this stuff. What does it mean if there's no actual party structure that connects leaders to members in an accountable way? What's missing here is fundamentally that you can't pay dues and become a rank and file member of the Democrats like you can in the Labor Party or in DSA. Nobody votes. There's no like mass way for the rank and file to vote on who the leader of the Democrats is. The Democratic Party, such as we understand it, is a much more diffuse thing. And so this leads to the question, one of the motivating questions of doing this series of presentations and workshops is this question of, well, okay, so if the Democrats are this sort of gigantic mess, what if maybe we should make DSA, which is already an actual member-run organization, which, as I've said earlier, is somewhat more like a party, into something like a totally independent party. And this is the discussion that's been going on in recent years in DSA. And that's where I'm going to give you sort of the first stage of some stuff that I think we all should be up to speed on about the sort of the debates that have been had about this on the left and in DSA over the last 10 years. So part 3, sort of, before I end this off, is introducing an article that some of you may be familiar with, some of you have read, some of you have not. I encourage you to check it out because I'm going to give you some points, and if you come to future sessions, I'm going to return to it because it is significant. It represents something significant in a shift in electoral thinking on the socialist left in the United States in the last 10 years, which is this article by my comrade Seth Ackerman in Jacobin in 2016, so just after Trump was elected the first time, called Blueprint for a New Party, where he addresses some of these contradictions between what the Democrats are, what the left wants to be, how we deal with the electoral system and the party system as it actually exists in the United States. So let's see. Welcome in Daniel, welcome in Dino. I understand people running in late. It's all good. We are recording, so you can always catch up. I hope you'll come in on discussion as we go. So yes, before we move on, Allie's got a question.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for doing this. It's really helpful. I'm still trying to catch up in terms of how this makes sense, but I guess I'm trying to understand how is, for instance, the DSA different from the Working Families Party, or yeah, I think maybe that's the best one, or the Green Party, because those are also independent parties, right?
Right. So that's a good question, and it's one I'm going to get into in more detail actually in the next session,
Okay.
because that one
I will hold my fire then.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of an answer now because it is a good question. So the short answer is, yeah, those both represent slightly different models. The Green Party is a model that is based on is very focused on controlling a ballot line. So basically being a party that has a ballot line that says Green Party on it and runs people as Green Party candidates against, in general elections against Democrats. And that is sort of the organizing principle of what the party is about. I mean, separate from that, obviously, there's like what their actual substantive platform and politics are and how they're internally organized. But that has been historically the focus of the Green Party. The Working Families Party has been it comes out of this history of fusion voting, which again I will get much more into next time. But the Working Families Party is an attempt to get around a thing that I'm about to talk about, which is the problems of the ballot line, where New York, where the Working Families Party sort of began and still is the strongest, allows you is a system that allows basically a single candidate to be endorsed by multiple parties at the same time, so that's how it is that you can have candidates appear on the Democratic ballot line, but then also on the Working Families ballot line. What I would say about both of them, as in distinction to DSA, is they are much more electoral and sort of ballot line focused. Like that is their primary area of emphasis, is running candidates and protecting their ballot line, whether it's the independent Green Party ballot line or the Fusion Working Families Party ballot line, and everything sort of revolves around that. Whereas for DSA, electoral is one of the things that we do, and we have a strategic orientation that often means that when we run electoral candidates, we run them on Democratic ballot lines. But there's a much bigger picture, whether it's labor organizing or tenant organizing or mutual aid or other things that we do. And so, at least the way I see it, DSA is sort of has a project that goes much beyond this question of like having your own ballot line and running candidates on it. I don't know. Does that make sense as at least as sort of a first answer to that question?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Peter.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for asking. I appreciate people interacting. All right. So continuing on with this. So this article, which is again, I encourage people who have time to go check it for yourself because it really lays out a lot of things that became very influential. This article that Seth wrote in 2016 tries to answer this question of what it means in the context of the United States to build an independent working class party. And he says a working class party must be democratic and member controlled. It must be independent, determining its own platform and educating around it. It should contest elections. So he's taking the view of a party that it should be electorally focused, at least in part. And its candidates for public office should be members of the party and accountable to the membership and pledge to respect the platform. So you need a real member-based democratic organization with a connection between members and leaders in a way that like the Democrats don't have. However, he goes on to say, what is missing from this list? There's no mention of a separate ballot line. Here we get to a distinction with what I was just talking about in response to Allie's question about things like the Green Party and the Working Families Party, which are very centered around having their own ballot line. What Seth is suggesting is that the essential things about having an independent party are not about that. So to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about the background of how the party system that we have evolved in the US and actually how weird it is. So before, in the early days of the US, in the 19th century, you had what was called the Jacksonian system. And in those days, parties were private organizations. They really were just independent organizations that did their own thing. And in fact, they produced their own ballot for voters to bring to the polls. Like literally the party would make a ballot, you would get the ballot from your party that you supported and you would take it to the polls. And that was how people got elected. And what candidates would appear on that ballot was just decided by these parties, that the Democrats and Republicans and Whigs and whatever of their day. And these weren't super democratic organizations. They were mostly local elites and things that were kind of making these decisions and deciding who appeared on the ballot. But it was independent of the government. These were independent parties. However, there was a lot of corruption in this system. There were a lot of sort of like, there was a good government argument for sort of reforming this in various ways. And after the late 19th century, there was a move toward the government actually administrating primary elections in a more overt way. And this sort of led to the introduction of what's called the Australian ballot. So this indicates this wasn't just a US thing. This is happening all over the place. First in Australia, and this just means the Australian ballot just means literally the government prints the ballots, which is just like what we all take for granted now. Is that like the ballot you get on election day is printed out by the Board of Elections, which is a government agency. They decide who can appear on that ballot. They print out that ballot. That is not the way it used to work, but it is the way that it works now. Along with that, of course, if the government is printing the ballots, they have to decide who gets to appear on the ballot. So this introduces requirements for appearing on the ballot, like you have to go out and get signatures to appear on the ballot. And many of us just recently have been engaged in the process of going out and gathering signatures for our socialist candidates that we support just so that they can appear on the ballot. Even candidates like who are already in office, who are running for reelection, just to appear on the ballot to get reelected, you have to go and get people to sign so that you can appear. And this is all because of this government run electoral system, which is what emerged after the 19th century in the US. Now, as I said, this is something that happened in many countries that have sort of bourgeois democratic electoral systems. But what happened in the US was extreme. It's particularly repressive and undemocratic in this country. So this is a quote from a source that Ackerman cites where he says, "Nowhere is the concern about governing party repression," meaning basically in this country, the two big parties, the Democrats and Republicans, "greater than the United States. As partisan influence is possible at all stages of the electoral contest." And what this means is things like high thresholds for ballot access, meaning you need a lot of signatures. So like you can have in small cities like Poughkeepsie or Newburgh, just to get on the ballot in a race that may be decided with under 1,000 people voting, you might need hundreds of people to sign just to get you on the ballot, which is not like things some people take it for granted, but that is actually an extremely undemocratic feature of our system. There are also special rules that only apply to Democrats and Republicans, that they get to appear basically automatically on the ballot, and that every other party has to jump through more hoops to get there. And of course, the people that make these rules are the people that represent Democrats and Republicans. And it's built very deeply into the system. So like the Board of Elections, for example, the County Board of Elections is structured in such a way. Like I worked briefly at the Board of Elections, and it's structured in such a way that all the entire place, not just the people at the top, but every employee is divided into Democrats and Republicans. And there's lots of things that you cannot do unless you have like a paired Democrat and a paired Republican to do them together. This is not part of an independent party structure. This is part of the government. This is part of the state. So the system is structured in such a way that it is structurally difficult for third parties to get over these hurdles. And if you do set yourself up as sort of an officially recognized party and you get your signatures and you get on the ballot, that opens you to all kinds of sort of state micromanaging of your internal structure as an organization. So like if DSA were a party in the sense of having its ballot line and being recognized as a party committee and all of that, then that would open us to even more sort of intrusive government interference in our internal processes than we already have to deal with for tax reasons and so on. So this is the kind of structural reason why it's and again, the rest of the series is going to get more into this sort of history of trying to deal with this. But this is why it's structurally very hard. Why it's easy to say, yes, we need a third party alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. It's very easy to say that, and it's very hard to figure out how to actually make it politically work. And so what ends up happening, given this state managed party system, is you get insurgencies within the parties. Like what happens when you kind of work within the parties? You get you tend to get candidate-centered insurgencies, and the best example of that in recent years is Bernie Sanders, who whether he's a Democrat, he didn't run on a Democratic ballot line, but at the same time he caucuses with Democrats and votes for their leaders, so he's an ambiguous case. But very much the Bernie Sanders movement was built around one person and the people around him who decided to run, and then a movement built around it, rather than the opposite of a sort of mass movement selecting a candidate and running them. And that's what tends to happen. You get internal mobilization by politicians rather than external mobilization by masses of ordinary people. Uh, Goodbye, Grace. Thanks for joining us. Dino, you are on the stack.
This may be covered later, but I'm really interested because I'm hearing about how it's really difficult to run as a third party. And at the same time, we know the famous examples of like Eugene Debs, who ran like 5 times, one time, I think getting close to or more than 10% of the total vote. So I'm curious, like, how could that play out in today's um, electoral system that we have? But maybe you'll talk about that later.
Yeah, so basically the next session is going to be dedicated to actual historic third party attempts, and the Socialist Party, I said at the beginning before you got here, I'm definitely I'm still putting that together and taking input on which particular case studies are the most important to cover. So I will definitely be talking about Debs and the Socialist Party, among others, as examples of relatively successful third parties. But we should emphasize this is relatively successful. Like, what Debs and the Socialist Party accomplished was massive relative to what most third parties have accomplished, but it still amounted to just a very successful protest vote ultimately. And I think the reasons I'm laying out are some of the structural reasons why. But again, yeah, next session we will get into more detail about what the lessons of that are and what the sort of positive and negative balance sheet is of what some of the more successful third party attempts like the Debs Socialist Party did. So I don't know. Does that address it sufficiently for now, Dina? Um, so going back to what we have when you work within the Democratic Party is, yeah, you get this sort of candidate-centered insurgencies, and what ultimately happens, because you don't have a membership base, because you don't have like a clear line of accountability between members and leaders, what you have is a periphery of like progressive nonprofits that kind of connect the base, which is just like random progressives that want something better, and the candidates. So that's like groups like Move On or Justice Democrats or like Our Revolution, which came out of the Bernie campaign in 2016. These are not really accountable membership driven organizations. They're accountable to like their donors or whoever, and that's sort of the only thing that exists to mediate between a mass base and a candidate in the absence of a real like structured party. So and so what's the alternative to that? Well, one alternative is, like Dina was just suggesting, you can just try to run a full-on third-party candidate that does not run on a Democratic ballot line, that does not try to mess around with any of that. And what Ackerman suggests is that there's sort of a trap inherent in that because of all of the hurdles inherent in the system that I just kind of talked about. He says the perverse consequences of the system are often at their most visible when third parties do succeed at getting on the ballot. And this is relevant, especially to things like the Green Party. And this is a bit, this is not he's not a sympathetic to third parties. And I will say in a moment that there's more to it than this. But he notes, and I don't think this is wrong, that third parties are frequently forced to devote a bulk of their resources not to educating voters or knocking on doors on election day, but to waging petition drives and filing ballot access lawsuits. Right. And that's through no fault of their own. It's the way the system is set up if you want to run on a third-party ballot line. And he goes on to say that these obstacles tend to repel serious and experienced local politicians and organizers while disproportionately attracting activists with a certain mentality, disdainful of practical politics or concrete results, and less interested in organizing or even really winning elections rather they're interested in bearing witness to the injustice of the two-party system. So, that's a whole different approach to electoral politics, of potentially waging taking a moral stand, waging a protest against the system, even though you are very little chance of winning. And what he's suggesting is that the third party ballot line strategy tends to attract people that are more interested in that. Daniel, you are on stack.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I think this quote is really interesting, and one example I would use for how third parties get a lot less attention and help is like, so I'm running for office right now as a socialist, but in a Democratic primary. And so at the Dutchess County Board of Elections, there is a person who is a Democrat who's basically assigned to help me figure out all the different ways about like, I can email her and ask her like, hey, when is this paperwork due? Or, hey, what's the deadline for this or that? And she's supposed to, like, her job is to like answer my questions. And the Republicans have someone like that too. The Republican BOE person is supposed to help the Republican candidates figure out all the different stuff they need for running for office, and then also help administer the election, like the primary election, and make sure that the candidates are treated fairly in the general election. But as far as I know, like the Green Party doesn't have someone like that at the Board of Elections. And so like if you were running for office in the Green Party or some other third party, like you wouldn't have a government employee who was like assigned to try to help you with that. And so yeah, and then another thing that I'm wondering if you'll touch on, that I think is one of the reasons why a third party hasn't emerged in America is like, unfortunately, our politics is extremely presidential focused, to the point where like a lot of people don't think you matter unless you're like running a candidate for president or you've elected someone to presidency. And the Socialist Party was like able to elect like 100 mayors and like a bunch of and a bunch of people to state office and even 2 people to the U.S. House, but they were never able to win the presidency, and so like that made it really hard to like I think be taken seriously by more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I mean, for the first part, yeah, I mean, it sort of goes to what I was talking about before. Like, it is amazing, and I think people who haven't directly experienced this part of the system don't really often realize how much the Democrats and the Republicans are sort of just part of the government in a way. They're not totally independent entities. They're built in. The two-party system is built into the government, and what you're talking about at the Board of Elections is part of that. The way that you know a county board of elections will have 2 commissioners. One is a Democrat, one is a Republican, and then there's a parallel structure beneath them. And they do the things like Daniel was talking about, like helping out candidates and making sure that sort of Democrats and Republicans can compete. And there is just nothing like that for any kind of independent party effort. It's like the system is structured to make it much more difficult for anyone else to break in, which is why, and we'll get into this will be not the next session, but this third session, we'll get more deeply into the implications of the argument that Ackerman makes in this argument and what it meant for DSA's electoral strategy and how it feeds into the socialists in office that we have now and the debates that are happening in DSA about electoral strategy today. But, and this is all a good segue because we're coming to the end of what I have for tonight, the next session is going to get more into the other thing that Daniel mentioned and that others have also brought up, which is what different third parties were and were not able to achieve either at a federal level or at a local level, because they're, it's not all as much as there are structural impediments, as much as there are reasons to think that, it can sometimes seem like a dead end to pursue third party organizing. It is more complex than that. And so in the next section, I'm going to do a little bit more of the history and a little bit more of the case studies. So up here on the screen, I have some graphic examples of things. The Socialist Party, Eugene Debs famously won millions of votes for president. The Labor Party, which was an attempt in the 90s to form a labor, a labor movement based third party. The Working Families Party, which is the descendant of a longer tradition of fusion organizing, which we'll talk about. The Communist Party, the Green Party. That's going to be kind of the focus of the next session. But before I close it off and sort of open it up to anything more that people want to talk about, I'm just going to leave us sort of flipping back around to this idea that I sort of started with, that we do need to think about, especially as DSA, as people who are part of an ideological organization, a socialist organization, an organization with a bigger vision. There's another way to think about the party that's not just about ballot lines and it's not just about elected officials. And so this is a very long quote that I just put on screen, but I'm just going to read it so that you don't have to. This is from Vivian Gornick's book, The Romance of American Communism, which is a it's a not uncritical look at the experience of people who were communists in the mid-20th century, but is also a very sort of loving and like empathetic look at what it meant to be a communist at the heyday of the Communist Party, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And so this is a quote from a woman named Norma Raymond, who's interviewed by Gornick for this book, talking about what it meant to be in the party in that era, and talking about someone who, was being persecuted by the government, had to go underground, and so on. And she says, when Charlie went underground, people in the party brought everything from chicken soup to apartments to clothes for the children to airplane tickets to you name it, they brought it. And even beyond that, beyond crisis, it was a total world, from the schools to which I sent my children, to family mores, to social life, to the quality of our friendships, to the doctor, the dentist, and the cleaner. There was an underpinning to everything in our lives that affected the entire variety of daily decision, reference, observation, everything. No one who didn't live through it can understand what it was like or why it was so hard to give up. People now long for community. They're dying for lack of it. Community can't be legislated. It's an organic sense of things that comes up out of the social earth. It's a commonly shared ideal. That's what it is. Nothing else will ever create community. And we had it. We had it in every conscious as well as unconscious response to ourselves, to each other, to the world we were living in, and the world we were making. Right, wrong, errors, blind pro-Sovietism, democratic centralism, the lot notwithstanding. In our lives as communists, we had community. We had integration. We had that civilizing sense of connectedness. It's the heart and soul of all civilized life. It wasn't just good wine in our veins, that life, it was ambrosia. So I leave you with that because I think that's something even when we're thinking about the nuts and bolts about what it means to get ballot access and all the rest of it, I think that's what as socialists is something we should keep in the back of our minds when we're talking about the party, when we're talking about what we're collectively building together. That's the horizon is that as much as anything. Valencia, thanks for joining us. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you at the next one. And yeah, we are at the end. I threw a few questions if, in terms of like what is it important to conceive of the party as a distinct kind of organization? What are its most important features? How does DSA measure up to all of this? But anything really, any questions, any reactions people have. I went on a little longer than I intended, but hopefully it has been useful to people. This is a bit of an experiment. This is the first time presenting this in exactly this form. So I'm happy to get any feedback, but also, yeah, just any thoughts, any reactions people have. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, this was very informative. If you're able to post the slideshow in Slack later, that would be great. Because I would love to look over this again. But I would say that yeah, I mean the way I view DSA is like as a proto party, like a party in everything except a ballot line. Like we have candidates who come up out of the organization, right? Like I did. I'm running on a platform that like was like informed by like the members, and what our members care about, and my the people who are like funding the campaign are basically DSA members from this chapter and DSA members all over the country who donated, and like the people who are knocking on doors, like 90% of them have been DSA members, and so like that's like it's like the entire campaign from top to bottom is like being powered by DSA members and their labor and their money. Thank you. And so like yeah, to me it's just like we are running like a DSA campaign, and like yeah, I mean I guess when I get into office, if I get into office, like I would be caucusing with the Democrats, but like you never forget who brought you to the dance. Or at least I don't think I will. So
Yeah. Ali says this is super helpful. Glad to just get an education. Thank you so much. And I'll go to you on Stack and then I'll come back to you, Dino. So go ahead, Ali.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Dino. I think just a question for Daniel and also maybe everybody else. Like, I get the what the argument is about not being on the ballot line, and I think the campaigning and the door knocking has been super informative and super helpful, especially here in Newburgh, with Giselle. But at the same time, I wonder like, how did a totally uninformed person going to the ballot box in June during the primaries, how do you know to vote for the progressive candidate or the DSA candidate?
Yeah, so Dan, you have a director to that.
yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean I think that like we rely a lot on our ground game to like turn out voters, and our ground game, um, but I do think that our candidates, I personally feel that all of our DSA candidates should be running like pretty explicitly as democratic socialists. So like it says that like on the website and every single piece of literature that I've printed so far, that have all been union printed, says like that I'm a democratic socialist. Now that's not the only thing it says, right? It says a whole bunch of other stuff about me living in
Right.
and all the different issues I'm running on. But I did feel it was very important to include that along with the chapter logo, because I do think that, like, even though I think that, like, the way we can elect the most candidates and win the most races is by running people in Democratic primaries, I also think it's important for us to build our own brand, and like really emphasize the democratic socialist part. Um, uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think what Dana said is right, and I think it's part of why I think it is important for us to be building up our identity as an organization beyond just the elections that we run in. And obviously, it also helps when we get to a point, in New York City, they have a whole bunch of socialists in office. There's a sense of, oh, there's the DSA crew, and they're distinct from the rest of the Democrats. We're only starting to build that up here, but I think insofar as we're also visible, we're visible in tenant rights fights, that we're visible in labor organizing, that we're visible in other places. We don't rely on the ballot line to tell people who we are. We have other ways to tell people who we are, and so that allows us to, in some ways, get around the limitations of having to deal with the obstructions that the system puts in front of us. But yeah, Dino, go ahead.
Yeah, reflecting on these questions that you're talking about, I mean, I agree with Dan about DSA being a proto party. I mean, DSA has a base, has resources, has education. I think the biggest thing it lacks when it comes to, I think it's the most important part of a party is that it has the power to change society. And I think we are sometimes overemphasizing like how much we can do, and sometimes underemphasizing what we can do as well as DSA. Yeah, so and this thing about how it's so hard to get past the hurdles of the American system, it reminds me of what Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist, talks about, which is he was trying to understand like even when the conditions are ripe, do the people think that it is possible to have this different world? And in Italy, the conditions were right, but the people just didn't believe it was possible. And yeah, I'm just like trying to understand what will help us get to that point. One of the examples I hope that we'll be able to talk about is the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, and they built a lot of power through a lot of strike power, and were able to affect politics, and just create crises that made the government capitulate to their demands. But then in the end, they got swallowed up by the Democratic Party as well. But yeah, these are things I'll be curious for us to talk about.
Yes, thank you. And I am taking notes to make sure that I hit these particular case studies next time when we do the third parties. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. And I'm gonna drop, because I have to. I'm gonna drop my Canvas link in the chat if anyone wants to join us. But I have so many thoughts on this question. I mean, unsurprisingly, and just this topic in general. And some of the things that I hope we'll be able to cover, you probably already have this in the plan, is just like the Working Families Party, which I have been involved with for a couple of years. I find to be such a fascinating entity, because it was really started as like it is made up of a coalition of progressive nonprofits and labor unions, and those groups pay money into WFP in order to get votes within WFP and to keep the party going. So like, I work at a nonprofit that pays money into the Working Families Party. In return, my nonprofit gets a certain amount of votes in the party, but the groups within the party are not actually bound to the decisions the party makes. So many times, the Working Families Party will endorse a progressive candidate, but then the labor unions that are inside the Working Families Party won't necessarily be supporting that progressive candidate. And so, obviously they found a model that kind of works, right? They have enough money to keep the party going, and they've maintained their ballot line. But then also they have I think there are legitimate critiques of like how much success they've actually had in like as a party in terms of, and usually they don't run candidates only on the WFP line, right? Usually they're cross-endorsing Democratic candidates, endorsing the progressive candidate in the primary, and then endorsing whoever the Democrat is in the general election. That's generally their policy. they don't really like to have people running on the WFP line only, except in very rare cases. And so I think that is a very fascinating thing to get into. But then another thing that I find very interesting, and also has to do with labor, is just in New York City, look right now, New York City DSA, Zoran is running an incredible campaign, right? Like they have knocked hundreds of thousands of doors. I don't know the exact number. They have hundreds of volunteers, right? They were the first campaign to raise the $8 million, and the first campaign to be on TV. And they're second in the polls behind Cuomo, and yet the unions are almost all, not all, but almost all of the unions are tripping over themselves to endorse Andrew Cuomo. Now, a lot of that is because the unions don't really have a democratic, process for endorsing candidates, right? It's not like every single member of that union voted to endorse Cuomo, but the unions feel wedded not only to the Democratic Party but also to the establishment or moderate candidates who are coming out of that party. And so, in a lot of races, like when Sarah Hanna ran in her primary, the unions were all endorsing Cahill or staying out. They were not endorsing Sarah Hanna, not the first time. Now that Sarah Hanna is the incumbent, they're endorsing her, but not the first time. And so I think those are, I guess, all obstacles to a successful third party, obstacles to us even winning races within the Democratic primaries. But then also yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just rambling there, but I think there's a lot of interesting things to dig into in those examples.
Yeah. No, I absolutely, and we will definitely get into that. I am going to now. I already can see I'm going to struggle to keep the Working Families Party section of next session in check to cover everything else, because there's what you're talking, there's the history of the I mean, first of all, you could do a whole nother thing about the labor movement and its institutional conservatism and what drives that and how that feeds into the way they relate to something like the Working Families Party. But then there's also DSA's historical and the left's historical relationship to the Working Families Party, its origins in the new party and the strategy of fusion voting. All to say, this will be covered next time, because it's very important. Bye, Kristen, Danny. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time. Yeah, and I think we're winding down. But yeah, we just wanted to say, yeah, we will be back on for this sort of the overview of some of these examples of third parties in U.S. history next time, and then the session after that is going to get into some of these deeper into some of these questions about DSA strategy in particular, both DSA as a potential party or a proto party, as Daniel is sort of suggesting, or also what DSA's approach to electoral politics is. And this is where you can learn the ins and outs of the actual tendencies, the caucuses, the position papers that exist within DSA among people debating what sort of organizations in DSA be, what should our electoral strategy be. Because one of my objectives with this series is to get us into a place where, the sort of high level strategic debates that are had, that are going to play out at the national convention this summer are something that everyone can participate in. And, in order to do that, we all have to have some baseline. You can't expect that everyone who joins DSA just knows the ins and outs of this stuff. So we're trying to create a place where we can understand not just these high level questions of electoral politics that we talked about today, but ultimately how this really relates directly to what this organization does and how we all fit into it as members of DSA. So we're gonna, it's not something we do enough in this organization, often because people are afraid of seeming like they're taking a sectarian side in one or another political debates in the organization. But this is the space where we're going to do that, not take sectarian sides, but put people's positions on the table so that we can understand what this big, beautiful, big tent of an organization is about and what the stakes are for some of these debates about how we address some of these fundamental questions of what it means to be a party, what it means to engage in electoral and other forms of politics in the context of the modern United States. Yeah, it's yeah, this has been great. I appreciate everyone who's come and participated. I'll leave it open here if anybody's got anything else they want to throw out. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. And yeah, Allie, Amanda, awesome. Dino, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, I got one last comment, but this has been awesome. I'm glad that we got to go in. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about those two choices that you're kind of talking about is like you're either consumed by the Democratic Party or it's a protest vote. And like we talk about like building power within and changing, like reforming the labor institutions, the unions and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, what do you think about like forcing away some of those partners inside of the Democratic institution, like the labor unions, the progressive nonprofits? What other like, players can we try to like take away from that? Yeah, from the democratic institutions that we build our power as like a socialist institution.
So yeah, so it's tricky. So I mean, that gets to something I wanted to spend more time on and didn't really get to, which is this question of the Democratic Party as this amorphous ecology of institutions that includes its elected officials and its donors and the NGOs and the unions and like and so because it's not like a just and yeah consultants and it's like and because there isn't a single it's not a cohesive organization the way that DSA is or even the way that something like the Labor Party or like a European Socialist Party is. It's like we can think about it as yeah, what would it mean to sort of peel off pieces of that coalition? And like some are, like some unions are potentially, they tend to have the sort of conservative impulses that Daniel was talking about. It can be difficult to win, for some good and some bad reasons. Unions are, want to sort of stick with what they know and stick with what seems safe to them. And so it can be difficult to peel off. But at least in terms of their like material interest, unions are potential allies in a way that like, yeah, like a lot of NGOs or like consultants or billionaires or whatever are not. And like, yeah, a thing that like that I meant to talk about and just didn't have time was this sort of like thinking about working with and against Democrats as peeling off pieces of this ecosystem rather than like taking over or like reforming the Democrats because the Democrats doesn't really exist. And there's the example in DSA of what happened in Nevada where DSA members basically took control, like they won election to like the official positions of leadership in the Nevada Democratic Party. But then like the old guard, like the Harry Reid allies, basically just like took their ball and went home because they had control over the donors, they had control over the money. And so they were able to basically just say, okay, you won these positions, but they don't mean anything. We're just going to go we're going to just take it elsewhere. That's indicative of the fact that there's kind of no there, that the only way to like win power within that democratic ecosystem is to peel parts of it off rather than thinking there's some kind of like great height that you can achieve and just win power over and then you control the Democrats because it just doesn't work like that. Daniel, you had something.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Another example, and yeah, Peter's example there was great because like that was progressives and socialists who took over the Nevada, the Democratic Committee of the state of Nevada, but it didn't actually change anything. And another example is here in New York State. There were some progressives who pushed for the New York State Democratic Committee to pass a resolution in favor of good cause eviction, and they were successful. And so the New York State Democratic Committee was, we support good cause eviction. Well, what happened? That didn't cause any of the legislators who weren't on good cause. That did not get any of them to sign on to good cause because like that's not where the power is. It's where there is some money, right? And there is some like institutional relationships, but didn't actually have the power to force the electeds to get onto the bill that they didn't want to get onto. And so like that the party just doesn't have a mechanism for doing that. I think another really interesting thing that I would love to discuss here, or maybe in electoral working group meetings or something, but it's just like, what should our candidates' relationship to the Democratic committees and the Democratic Party be? Because like we are like kind of walking a line, right? Like, Giselle is like Sarah Hanna ran by running against someone who was endorsed by the Ulster County and Dutchess County Democratic committees. She ran against the incumbent, then she won. But now Sarah Hanna is endorsed by the Ulster and Dutchess Democratic committees. And like Giselle is endorsed by the Orange County Democratic Committee. And like for me, my committee's staying out of the race. But like if I get elected and then I'm running for re-election, the committee would probably be endorsing me. And so like what does that mean? Like, does that mean we're being co-opted? What does that mean? Like, another thing I always think about is like, okay, so when you get into office, like you caucus with the other Democrats, right? Like if Sarah Hanna went to Albany and chose not to caucus with the Democrats, she would basically have no influence, right? But like being in that room, what does being in that room mean for being a socialist? And I guess like the socialists have their own rooms, right? Because there's the SIO committee and the socialists in office where they all meet together and talk about things and decide how they're going to act in that other room with all the Democrats. But like, what does it mean to be in that room, and what does that mean for our electeds? And then another thing that I always think about is, oh yeah, is like, I do think that the Democratic committees up here are like somehow they're less. I do think in some ways they're less machine like than the Democratic committees in New York City. And some of the examples that I use when I say that are like that the New York City Democratic committees are never endorsing our socialists in office in New York City, no matter what. Even though they're incumbents, even though they're multi-term incumbents who have close relationships in their district, like those Democratic committees are not endorsing them. But like up here, the Democratic committees endorse our candidates when they're incumbents. Like up here, a lot of the Democratic committees are powered less by consultants and more by just like well-meaning grannies and grandpas who were like, I want to stop Trump, so I'm going to join my local Democratic committee. And so like in some ways, like, can those people be won over to democratic socialism? Not the party apparatus, but I mean the individuals. And like, what does that mean if we're entering those spaces and trying to bring those people towards our point of view? Does that mean anything? Or like, what does that mean if it means something? So I don't know. Those are some of the questions I think about.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that should be maybe like a deeper, maybe like electoral working group conversation. Because like, yeah, like just the committees on their own could be a whole discussion about like, do they matter? What, if any, power do they have? Like, they're another one of these like pieces of what we call the Democrats that like don't actually have much power and like, but that like people perceive to be meaningful. And so there's always this question about, does it matter to be endorsed by them? Does it matter for people to serve on them? Like, is that a waste of time? Like, I have my own strong feelings about that, but it's like that is the kind of sort of like, you know, nitty gritty stuff that is actually worth talking about. Maybe not even at the sort of high level of this kind of event, but like, yeah, I think we should be spending more time talking about that kind of stuff because otherwise it just sort of bubbles up and people don't have a clear analysis of it.
Yeah.
All right. I think probably should call it, if for no other reason than it's 1:30 in the morning for me. And I'm planning to celebrate May Day tomorrow because I'm in Germany where it's an actual holiday and people will
Break a
be.
bank open. Hope you're having a good time up there.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks y'all. And we'll yeah, well I'll see you back in the Hudson Valley pretty soon and see folks yeah, for one of these in a couple weeks.
All right. Happy May Day, comrades. See y'all.
All right, you too.